Hi, everyone. Welcome to the impact of proposed SNAP cuts on students and schools, co-sponsored by the Food Research and Action Center, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, American Federation of Teachers, American Heart Association, Center for Science in the Public Interest, Food Corps, Moms Rising, and School Nutrition Association. I'm Steve Hayward, FRAC's Communications Manager. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few brief housekeeping items. We expect this webinar to run about 60 minutes. We are recording the presentation and will send the recording and slides in a follow-up email. Closed captioning is available. To turn captions on, click the CC button in the bottom taskbar and select English as the spoken language. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. To ask a question at any time, please use the Q&A tab in the bottom taskbar. With that, I'll pass it off to Alexis Bylander, Director of Child Nutrition Programs and Policy at FRAC. Take it away, Alexis.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about what cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly referred to as SNAP, would mean for school meal operations, students, and schools. We are coming together today because the budget reconciliation bill currently being put together by Congress includes historic cuts to SNAP. This is a concern in and of itself, but additionally, any cuts to SNAP that reduces the number of families receiving benefits will have a negative impact on school meals. That's because children in SNAP households are directly certified for free school meals, and direct certification rates are used to determine if a school can utilize community eligibility, a provision that allows high-poverty schools to offer free meals to all of their students. We're lucky to have a panel of great speakers with us today to share information and insights about this important topic. They include Gina Platanino with FRAC, Nadia Davis with the School Nutrition Association, Tara Thomas with AASA, the School Superintendents Association, and Tim Barczyk with the National Education Association. We'll put up our first slide, and as Steve mentioned, these are the co-sponsors of today's webinar, and we thank those organizations for partnering with us today. At the end of our discussion, we'll outline steps that you can take to influence the future of SNAP. We'll be encouraging you to contact your senators and ask them to vote against any budget reconciliation bill that hurts SNAP households and has ripple effects for students and schools. So let's get to it. Gina, we'll start with you. Can you walk us through the proposed cuts to SNAP currently under consideration in Congress? This will give us the groundwork that we need for the rest of the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexis, so much for having me, and great to be here with such great panelists. Steve, let's just go straight to SNAP. And before I get there, I think it's important for us to see, next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. It's important to contextualize because none of this happens in a vacuum, right? We do know that the SNAP program as a whole is incredibly impactful. It helps 40 million plus people. And these aren't just people, these are families, these are children. It's such a wide makeup of individuals. It helps people not having to choose between being able to afford rent, being able to afford utilities. It's an economy. It helps with the economy, it helps local communities, helps so many different things. And one of the things that I do want to touch on really quickly is that when there is SNAP, families don't have to sacrifice needs like housing, healthcare, utilities. For children, if we're looking at SNAP, it improves academic performances and overall health. And that's because kids, right? Parents don't have to sacrificing not having enough to eat. They can give it to their kids. And it also reduces caregiving depression, right? Which is a risk factor for poor childhood outcomes. And I'll end with this before we move on to our next slide. It is estimated to cost the US over $160 billion annually in excess healthcare expenses, food insecurity. And that's what SNAP does. It helps minimize these costs. It helps people have the economic mobility and to be able to meet their basic needs. Next slide, please. SNAP also has incredibly economic impact. I mentioned this because remember, there's always a balance of how municipalities, I know we talk about states, but how municipalities are able to afford things, how people are able to get the groceries where they go. And the local groceries, if they close, which they operate on a small margin, this means that there are less local taxes. That means that there are less local jobs. That means that these are less resources. SNAP brings in quite a lot of money to local economies, to the state. And if SNAP were to get cut at the drastic rate or any cuts, it will be incredibly detrimental. Next slide, please. And this is a map, and this is about 3 years old, but this is where, if you look across the country, SNAP brings millions and millions and millions of dollars to communities, to states. This is how much SNAP redemptions are, meaning retailers are taking this money, meaning that individuals are utilizing this money. And the best way to think about SNAP is a pass-through, right? Individuals, the federal government gives it to the states give it to the individuals in need, then take it to their local grocery, which then turns it over into income, into taxes, into so many things. Next slide, please. And again, huge shout out to all of our food pantries and all the food banks that work so incredibly hard. SNAP, for every meal that food pantries, food banks provide, SNAP provides 9. And remember that this program was created as an emergency relief, but individuals, because of the high cost of food and less of access to SNAP, have now utilized food banks as their main place where they go to food, and it's supposed to be an emergency. But if these cuts were to happen, we would see more of an overburdened task on all of these food pantries and food banks who are already at capacity. Next slide, please. And just really quickly, in terms of like where we are and why this is such a big deal, majority of individuals who utilize SNAP are over 35% are white Americans, then followed by 26%, and then Hispanics and 60%. And I think it's important to call this out because as these conversations happen, policymakers sometimes forget that the people who are utilizing these programs look like them. But also the slides also shows that the more barriers that we put, individuals like the populations, Hispanics, African Americans, will have a higher rate of food insecurity, have less access to these programs. So it's something to keep thinking about in terms of where do we see our country in the next 10 years if these cuts were to go through. Next slide, please. And again, majority of individuals who utilize SNAP are Americans, are US born citizens or naturalized citizens, almost 95%. And I mentioned this, the refugee 1.4% is because one of them, we're going to get to it, one of the proposals in both the House and the Senate version is that they will eliminate this provision that helps individuals who need humanitarian assistance. And just that 1.4% is thousands of individuals who really need assistance at a very critical time. And many of those include children. Next slide. So here we are. We are back to back of where we are. What you need to know, and we don't need to go so much in the weeds, is that the bills are pretty much the same in terms of the House and the Senate. If you haven't been following, which I doubt, I'll share is cost share. What is cost share? Historically, SNAP has always been covered, the benefits have always been covered by the federal government. And it's a federal entitlement program. That means that 100% of the food benefits and shares are administrative equally with the states. Under this proposal, starting in fiscal year 28, so that means after the midterms, after the national election, states will be required to pay at least 5% up to 25% and 15% on the Senate. The way that the percentages are done, it will be a little bit different. But what you need to understand is that it will change the way that SNAP benefits are funded. And this will depend on the error rates. So that means that states will have to pay more. And this will differ among states from $500,000 to high millions of dollars, less money going into people and less resources and access. The other part is, if you were to look at the FY 23 data as of today, that means that a high percentage, more than half of the states, will be forced to pay a high percentage. And that's because states fluctuate in terms of the error rates. At the same time, we look at administrative costs. Currently, the state pays 50% and the federal government pays 50%. Beginning, they will shift it where the states will now have to pay 75% instead of 50%, which again, on top of the cost share, that means that it is more expensive to now run the program, which will mean that states will have to make incredibly difficult decisions. And I just want to mention that according to the Congressional Budget Office, in terms of cost share, they estimate that because of this, subsidies provided for child nutrition programs will decrease for about 420,000 children in an average month, reducing redirect spending by about $700 million in 2028 and 2038. I know those are a lot of big numbers, but I just want to make sure that we capture the impact of what this will have on individuals. If we go down, Thrifty Food Plan is the way that the SNAP benefit, it is calculated. That will means that it will stay stagnant. It won't go up and won't go down, which means that, prices are going up. People will still get the same amount of benefit, which is highly concerned. This is time limits. We're going to spend a little bit on this of time limits. It means that it will raise the amount of that people who are under this really harmful provision that has been in place in 1996. It's called the able-bodied adults without dependents, meaning that certain individuals with an age bracket currently is 18 to 54 have to show that they're doing work, getting paid for at least 20 hours a week in order to get SNAP. If they don't do this, they're cut off SNAP. They can only get it for 3 months within a 3-year period. Both the House and the Senate want to increase this from 55 to 64. Highly concerning, as we know that the majority of, and this is for women, provide a lot of unpaid childcare, which will be incredibly detrimental. It put more people into poverty. It would also, for the first time in history, usually people have exempted from these time limits if they have a child under 18 in the house. And the House side is if you have a child under 7, you will be cut off. The adult will be cut off unless they are working. And the House is it's a little bit older, but it's still incredibly harmful. As you think about nationwide, very few places have sidewalks. There are kids who may have disabilities or may have other reasons why you may want to be able to parent your child and take them where people want to have that choice. So these individuals, these parents, most of the time, which are single parents, would have to show that they are working these hours or they will lose SNAP. The child will not, the parent will lose SNAP. But again, what this means is that there will be less resources for a household as a whole. Those are the main ones. And we can get the last one I'll mention that I did mention at the beginning is that it bars humanitarian immigrants. Those are the people we talk about, refugees, asylees, a very small percentage, but it would have a deep impact of individuals that will be impacted. We can go to the next slide. And I'll flag that we have a table in our website in FRAC that you can see all of this and we go more into detail. What this means is, in terms of numbers, we looked at Florida and Michigan, means millions of dollars now being spent on this instead of being able to be utilized as for resources. Next slide. And instead, what we are getting, why this is coming along, is for 2 reasons, right? If anyone read what the Senate came out of this, is they said we want a more fiscal balance. We want to make sure that American taxpayers' money is being utilized correctly. Well, we're in this place because we're trying to make sure that very few percentage, the top 1%, gets more permanent tax cuts. And in order to pay for this, we are sacrificing not just SNAP, but Medicaid, education, other programs in order to pay for this. And if we look back to history, the tax cuts of the Bush era, the tax cuts of the Trump era brought us into this place where we have a large national debt and we don't have the resources to pay for it. And in order to do so, we are increasing the national debt in order to make sure we have more permanent tax breaks for a very few percentage of Americans, while the rest of Americans will suffer permanently and will have it will affect their health, it will affect their income, and it is municipalities who will be incredibly impacted. Next slide, please. But I'll also mention that for one other reason. Both the Bush era and the Trump era try to cut down SNAP, and advocates like yourselves who are watching were able to push back on this. So I say that because we can still push back to make sure that there are no cuts. Everything that I mentioned, the CBO scores, I would focus on no cuts. We don't have to do this. And the reason why I circle this right here, 1996 opened the door for these time limits that we've been talking about. Once you open the door for any sort of cuts around SNAP, the door doesn't close. In 2023, this was expanded. It's now 2025, and they're looking at other ways to make sure that the program is even more restrictive for individuals. So if you get anything out of what I said today, no cuts. That is the major point that we want to make. They don't have to be. We don't have to negotiate on this. They don't have to move forward. Next slide, please. And again, municipalities, I know we talked about the state level, but municipalities at a local level cannot do this. They are still going to have constituents who are now not being able to access the program, higher food insecurity. And we have spoken to various municipal leaders across the country and have talking points for you if you need them. And one of the things that we want to hone in is this, that without SNAP, cities face increasing demand for social services, but without the funding that they need. So that means that they're either going to have to cut funding for services. That means that that pothole won't be filled, that ambulance that is needed won't be bought, or people are going to have to raise property taxes. Next slide. And again, at local grocers, it brings not only access for people to buy food, but also makes so many local taxes. Next slide, please. And we already spoke about how SNAP is such a tool to be able to fight off food insecurity, and it maintains emotional, physical, and academic development. Next slide. Alexis is going to go over this, the action steps that we can take to fight this off, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Alexis. Thank you. And we can take down the slides.
Great. Well, thank you, Gina. Everything that you just walked us through gives us the context that we need for what could happen to SNAP in the years ahead. So now let's turn to Nadia with the School Nutrition Association. Nadia, your association represents school nutrition professionals across the country, and the SNAP cuts that Gina just outlined would mean that fewer households would receive SNAP benefits and fewer children in those households would be directly certified for free school meals. Can you tell us what having fewer children directly certified means for school nutrition departments?
Sure. Thank you, Alexis. So I just want to start by saying there's a common misunderstanding out there that school nutrition programs are not part of these cuts. And that's because the language doesn't explicitly cut the programs, but what it does do is fundamentally change the foundation of the way that the programs work, putting access to school meals at risk for millions of students. So for years, school nutrition professionals have been dealing with an undue amount of administrative burden. They've spent hours on paperwork that could be better spent focusing on feeding students nutritious meals. These programs have been historically underfunded, understaffed, under-resourced, and forcing staff to rely on their creativity to create a sort of patchwork of funding and administrative solutions. And direct certification is part of that solution. So prior to direct cert, families had to complete complex applications, schools had to individually review them, they had to check for eligibility, and then they had to go through a required verification process. This required hours of data entry. In the end, many families and students fell through the cracks. So Congress and USDA recognized that this was unsustainable, and that's why they mandated something called direct certification, which eliminates many of these administrative challenges and helps ensure that students don't have to wait for paperwork to be fed. Direct certification allows schools to automatically match student enrollment records with SNAP and Medicaid databases. Children in participating families are instantly certified for free and reduced price meals. So there's no separate application process. No additional paperwork burden for both families and schools. And schools run these matches on a regular basis, notify the parent, and the parent doesn't have to take any further action. This system works really well. Instead of processing all those individual applications, school nutrition staff can certify hundreds or thousands of students. A recent SNA survey showed that programs are already very strained, and they have been for some time. Nearly all of the programs are reporting unpaid meal debt. Almost 9 out of 10 say families in need are not receiving benefits that they are entitled to. And 3/4 report students go hungry or they just choose not to eat. 90% of programs are reporting serious or moderate concern about the financial sustainability of their programs 3 years from now. So I wanted to set the stage. These cuts are not being proposed at a time of surplus. There is no surplus of staff, no surplus of funding. Schools are already struggling. Now, when you add these SNAP cuts, forcing hundreds of thousands of families off the program, the end result is that students will pay. Students go hungry. As Gina mentioned, a recent bipartisan CBO report estimated that 420,000 students at minimum will lose access to free or reduced price meals. And it's great to have that 420,000 number. However, we really want to stress that that's just the beginning. It's a very conservative number. It doesn't take into account all the cascading effects due to the impact of loss of direct certification or eligibility because families are losing SNAP benefits. So operationally on the school side, here's what's happening. Instead of automatically certifying children through data matches, schools will have to manually process applications for all families who lose SNAP. We're talking about potentially thousands of additional applications per district. Each application requires income verification, like we talked about, eligibility calculations, data entry, and follow-up. It's just not a good use of staff time. The timing is also terrible. Direct certification happens instantly when families qualify for SNAP, but application processing can take days or weeks. So during that gap, eligible children might go without meals or accumulate meal debt. And then there's another layer. Just like Gina mentioned, states are being asked to take over millions in funding, state cost share for SNAP. Every single line item in the state budget will be at risk when that happens, or if that happens. Hopefully it doesn't. School meal programs are in a vulnerable position and could risk losing additional state investment. Right now, states do chip in additional reimbursement. We have also seen since 2020 an amazing Healthy School Meals for All movement. I know many people on this call are probably part of the Healthy School Meals for All coalition. We've made great progress, and that progress is at risk too. I personally have heard from several states that they do not believe their states would be able to continue a Healthy School Meals for All program should these cuts actually be implemented. When direct certification becomes less effective, fewer schools also qualify for a program called Community Eligibility Provision. And that's a program that allows schools with a certain percentage of eligible children who are identified through direct certification to receive free meals without any applications. Tara will discuss that in greater detail next, but I do also want to mention that the loss of viability of community eligibility for schools also impacts how many children will in the end have access to healthy school meals. Direct certification is the foundation that allows school nutrition programs to efficiently feed millions of children every day. SNAP cuts would undermine this critical system and force us back to a paper-heavy application process for hundreds of thousands of families, precisely what Congress tried to eliminate when they made direct certification mandatory. So that, compounded on top of the state cost share, which would result in many states reducing funding for school meals, the cuts to SNAP making less students eligible for free and reduced price meals, and community eligibility no longer being a viable option for schools, in the end, we're looking at a very dire situation for the students who are relying on these meals.
Great. Thank you, Nadia. It is really helpful to hear directly from you about what cuts to SNAP would mean for school meal operations. And you had so many things that stood out to me, but one of them was that the creation of direct certification was really part of a solution to make school meal operations run more efficiently and effectively. And anything that rolls back the progress that we have made on direct certification is really a step backwards and in the wrong direction. But it isn't only school nutrition departments that will be impacted by cuts to SNAP. School nutrition departments fit into the larger context of schools and school districts. So turning now to Tara. Tara, less direct certification for free school meals means that more families will be applying for free school meals through an application. As has been noted, it will also lead to fewer schools being eligible to participate in CEP. Can you tell us what this means for school operations overall, school staff outside of school nutrition departments, and what is top of mind for superintendents right now?
Yeah, thank you, Alexis, and thank you for having me. A lot of what I'll talk about is basically what Nadia talked about and just expand a little bit more in terms of like what that looks like for at the district level. And the most immediate impact, like she discussed, is for all schools, right? And that the loss of direct certification, or the majority of direct certification for students would mean additional paperwork. And that is, just like Nadia said, that is time for not just school nutrition. Often, especially small schools where the staff is smaller, that might mean teachers are getting involved, principals are having to get involved, because it's not typically like you send out the paperwork and they bring it back the next day filled out. It's really difficult to get this paperwork done. And we learned that after COVID, right? We did universal school meals, healthy school meals for all, for a few years, and then going back into that free and reduced price model with all of this paperwork was really challenging, and explaining to parents why they had to fill this out for the first time, and what it means, and having that consistent communication with families is really difficult. And so often what we see are kids falling through the cracks, and then the increase of unpaid meal debt, because at the end of the day, schools are still going to provide those meals. But if we don't have reimbursement from the federal government because the paperwork's not filled out, then that cost is going to have to come from somewhere else. And typically what that means is it's going to have to be pulled from the budget elsewhere. So, they may try to make some cuts within the school nutrition program, but as Nadia already pointed out, those programs are already running, on the margins, like they're already really struggling for resources. And so that typically means that districts are going to have to look at their broader education budget and make cuts elsewhere in order to cover the loss of funding in school nutrition. And we'll see that more broadly as well. So not just for the lack of certification for free reduced price lunch in those forms, but we'll see that, even more broadly, maybe for community eligibility schools. And so the loss of CEP, or the loss of the ability to participate in CEP, if direct certification goes down, is also another calculation that districts are already having to make. And so if they are eligible for the community eligibility provision, and they're serving the healthy school meals for all, and it's a really popular program, and they are dealing with the reality that direct certification may increase, even if they may still be eligible for the program, they may not be able to afford it anymore. So direct certification determines eligibility, but it also determines how much you're reimbursed. And so if your direct certification goes down and how much you're being reimbursed from the federal government goes down, school districts right now are looking at that and thinking about, okay, if this happens and we lose, 20% of our ISP, and that's going to impact our reimbursement, are we going to be able to sustain this program? And unfortunately, I think the answer is going to be no. And then that means an entire school is going back to the free and reduced price model, and they're losing all of the benefits that we know come with healthy school meals for all. And so I think really at the end of the day, what this means is that school nutrition is not in its own budget. It is a part of the larger school district budget. And so right now, school districts are having to plan for, if this passes and they have to deal with this reality, how are they going to make it work? Because they have to pass a balanced budget. They're not able to run up a debt. And so if they want to keep, healthy school meals for all, then they may have to cut other educational opportunities, and they're going to have to make have really difficult conversations with their communities and make really difficult choices because of the cuts that would come. And I think, just to underscore what Nadia was saying earlier, is none of these cuts are in a vacuum. And so as we look at the cost share shift at the state level, and so if we're shifting costs from SNAP, we're also shifting costs from Medicaid, all within reconciliation, that's going to squeeze state's budget, not just for school nutrition, but for schools overall. And so that is something we're watching as well, is if K-12 is the next big bucket of funding that states have, but they also have to cover these new, responsibilities around SNAP and Medicaid, we're really concerned that they're going to unfortunately have to cut K-12 education more broadly. And so these are all kind of things that superintendents are thinking about, because they're having to think through all of the different responsibilities that they have, and they only have one budget, and all these things go in together. And so if they lose direct certification, or those are drastically reduced, at the end of the day, they're going to have to cut funding elsewhere to make sure that kids are still getting the meals that they need.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Tara. Superintendents have so many things that they need to take into consideration, and it's helpful to hear what stands out to them as these harmful cuts to SNAP are being considered. What stood out to me when you were talking is just the significant increase in paperwork processing that this would mean for schools. And I think very few people working at a school feel like they have any extra time in the day to take on responsibilities like pushing paper like this. And then also, I agree with you that I think most school leaders want to run community eligibility if it is possible for them. But at the end of the day, choosing whether or not they're going to do it is often a business decision. And if the numbers don't add up for it, then they're not able to do it, which is a real hurt to the students in the school that would benefit from everybody having access to free meals. So now, Tim, let's wrap up our panel with you. Less direct certification through SNAP would mean, like we've said, processing more school meal applications. And as just we know from history, more children that are eligible for free meals slipping through the cracks of the application process. So what would this mean for the school nutrition professionals that NEA represents and for students and schools overall from your unique perspective?
Well, thanks, Alexis, for remembering school nutrition workers in this conversation. I appreciate you and FRAC making the effort to get this perspective. So to just briefly reiterate, the families living in economic insecurity are already stressed. Perhaps it's a single parent head of household. It's parents, working multiple jobs. There may be a disability in the household. There may be a language barrier. And, every expert on the topic says there will be a good number of children who will slip through the cracks of the application process, and even more so should that process be made purposefully cumbersome. And school nutrition workers are literally on the front lines of dealing with hungry children. And that often means a school nutrition worker, telling a child whose parents are in arrears on school lunch debt, "Oh, I'm sorry, you can't have the same meal as your friends. Here you have to take this sun nut butter sandwich," or something of the sort. And quite frankly, there's also situations where a nutrition worker will not refuse a child in that situation the regular meal. And then we have added, personnel workplace complications. The worker's job may be in jeopardy, that sort of thing. Another lesser known aspect to this mess is that sometimes school nutrition workers are forced to act as debt collectors. They'll be given a list of parents in arrears to call. And ironically, that unfortunate circumstance has actually increased with some of the no shaming legislation that prohibits the use of school districts using debt collectors. And don't get me wrong, I don't want debt collectors used, but I'm just saying that's an added complication that school districts will sometimes foist that duty upon some of their staff. In addition to the immediate tragedy of these cuts, it's also frustrating because we were making a lot of progress in so many areas to just making the school meal program better. That includes that we now have more schools trying to source locally and fresh foods. And that means not only healthier meals for students, but working with fresh ingredients also means more skills needed for food service workers, more time needed for that food preparation, and real scratch cooking skills. And all of those things make for a better trained, better compensated, and more stable workforce. And that's characteristics often lacking in a heat and serve environment using processed foods. And we were making real gains in that area, which I think that these cuts will seriously push back. Finally, there are so many interconnected consequences. Some of my colleagues here on the panel have already indicated, but fewer children participating in school lunches, fewer schools able to utilize CEP. All of that means less money in the nutrition programs. That could possibly mean reduction in force. And although districts already have very low labor costs with school nutrition workers, they might seek even lower costs through privatization, which leads to another whole set of problems. So yeah, we've got a challenge on our hands, and we appreciate the work that that FRAC is doing to try to push back on this. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you to Tim and to all of our panelists. So next I want to walk through our call to action now, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So the Senate is expected to vote any day now on a harmful budget reconciliation bill that would slash the SNAP program and take food away from millions of children, older adults, and people with disabilities. And the ripple effect of these cuts would be felt far and wide for families, farmers, food retailers, and as we have discussed here. So tomorrow, June 17th, is our Protect SNAP Day of Action. It's a time to tell your senators to vote no on the budget reconciliation bill that includes harmful cuts to SNAP. And there are 4 advocacy actions that we want to offer for tomorrow. The first is that every call counts. We want to flood the Capitol switchboard number posted in the chat now, tomorrow, to make sure that every senator hears vote no from their constituents. You can tell your senators that they must protect SNAP and reject proposals to weaken or cut this proven anti-hunger program. And you can share in your message how cuts to SNAP would hurt school meals. Second, make some noise on social media. You can get the attention of your senators by tagging them in posts and asking them to vote no. And you can use FRAC's digital toolkit posted in the chat that is filled with sample posts and graphics, and use the hashtag ProtectSNAP. Third, send an email. You can use FRAC's Action Network, also posted in the chat, to send an email message directly to your senators to urge them to vote no on the budget reconciliation bill. Your message will show them how this harmful bill will have a ripple effect on people's health, the economy, and children's access to free school meals. And finally, you can join an emergency virtual rally to protect basic need programs, including SNAP, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act, and others. Tomorrow at 12:15 Eastern Time. It's hosted by the Coalition on Human Needs and Partners, and the registration link has been posted in the chat. So now we'll open it up to Q&A, and I wanted to start with the first note that I saw, which is, is there a concern that some families will be less likely to want to share personal information with the federal government through meal benefit applications in the current political environment? And I actually really appreciate this question because it's something that I wanted to bring up in the Q&A section regardless. And I think there is a misunderstanding if you're not intimately familiar with how school meal forms and operations work, that it really shouldn't be that hard to provide paperwork verifying your income. I think there are actually a lot of barriers to that. The first is that there can be literacy or language barriers to completing the form. There can be a fear of submitting a form based on the family's immigration status. And if you are a household that has multiple part-time jobs or seasonal employment, it can be hard to gather all of the paperwork required to go along with the form. And then finally, the form doesn't just ask for your salary or hourly wage. It also asks you to include information about child support payments, alimony, tips, other government benefit assistance that you may get, and many other items, which people don't want to share, particularly in small towns where they may very well know the school staff that process these applications. It's just more personal information about their household that they are comfortable sharing. So I think there's always been a resistance to submitting that much information along with the form. And to the person who posed the question, I think now is a time of heightened sensitivity about providing personal data. But I'd like to open it up to the panel to see if anybody else has remarks about the barriers associated with the school meal application form.
No, Alexis, I would just second everything you said. These are concerns that I often hear from superintendents, and they have to, be even, it's part of the necessary communication with families about what is the paperwork for, where does that data go? But I think also I think there could be a lot more support that we provide in how we slim down that paperwork, how we may streamline it if we do have to rely on it even more. But yeah, these are all concerns that I hear from members all the time, and why they're not getting the forms back from families. And I think it just depends on where you are. But I know that even more now so than ever, families are hesitant to provide any information to school districts.
Yes, I co-sign what both of you are saying, and I just want to add on there. For schools that have been running CEP for some time and now would not find it viable to do so, they haven't been collecting applications, some of them for several years. And so to suddenly turn around and expect all families to understand that they now have to submit this application is a monumental feat. And Alexis, you're probably about to address the AI question in the chat. Why aren't schools using AI to lower the burden of paperwork? Schools are operating on these shoestring budgets. So as I was explaining, they've already, miraculously pieced together all of these various available programs, including CEP and direct certification, just to make these programs work for the students that depend on them. And so while I love using AI, I think that kind of technological advancement will take great investment in our schools before we see something like that introduced into their system.
And if I could quickly add something, in the first round of Doge cuts, the entire Department of Education technical support team to school districts was cut. Now, with the recent court decisions, I don't know who is back at work, but just want to point that out that, the team that specifically was giving support to school districts in how to utilize AI was entirely eliminated.
And if I can just add, when it comes to AI and personal data, you have to be really careful. And so I actually don't know how much they would actually be able to utilize AI or how much we want them to, because that would, if it's a language model, then that means it's technically taking all their information. So there's a lot of privacy concerns there as well. But I think we should always be looking to see how we can streamline. The other thing I wanted to flag, to kind of build out what Nadia was saying about CEP and going from CEP, Healthy School Meals for All, and then pivoting back. That also means that a lot of families are going to have to go back to paying for meals. And so it's going to put a huge strain on the community as well, right? It's not just the paperwork burden, it's a complete shift in the entire model of who's getting meals and who has to pay, and reduced, free, full, right? And so I think that's also, and I know this webinar isn't about the importance of CEP and what a great program it is, but it's all tied together. And I think the loss of CEP will be really devastating in a lot of communities, and it will be directly connected to this reduction in direct certification.
Great. Well, thank you for all of those responses, adding color to the conversation here. And then the last thing that I should have mentioned when I talked about the barriers is just missing the application as it comes home. As the parent of 2 young children, I get a lot of crumpled up papers and backpacks, and families sometimes just honestly miss things. And I just, really believe that the end result of that missed paperwork, for whatever reason, shouldn't result in children being hungry at school. A question related to the school meal application process also posted in the Q&A box is, are immigrant families more at risk when filling out paperwork? What I know about this is that school meal applications have a place where you either put part of your social security number, or you say that you do not have a social security number. And I think in the past, we would have said that school meal application information stays in the school. Along with that, I think we are in unprecedented times of data sharing and concerns about what is happening to people's data. And so I'm not sure what to say above and beyond that at this time, but want to open it up for our panelists to add any additional information. And if people aren't coming off mute to answer, it might just be because this is a topic that is new and that we're all trying to wrap our heads around and understand more. So let's go to another question. This one is for Gina. Today is the first time that I have heard anyone call out that 2028 is the effective date for these SNAP cuts. This person is noting that that is after the next national election. So they're saying this would mean that the current administration would have the ability to blame the next administration for these cuts. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Gina, the delayed start date and what that means?
Oh, I think you said it in the way you asked the question. So just yes. So not all of them. So we have a table. I'll put it in the chat. So most of these happen immediately, But the cost share, the big one, do happen after the midterms and after the national election, right? Which is why representatives are able to email their constituents and say, I am fighting for these tax cuts and they won't impact you, because they won't right now, right? 2-3 years from now, if this goes through, all of a sudden, my benefits, I just got cut off. My benefits just decrease. Well, all of a sudden is my child's teacher just cut off. Why did school meals ended? When did this happen? Is it the change in administration or whatever we are? And so that's sort of the questions. And again, the House and the Senate are pretty similar. And whether that was the intention, that's what we can read from it. And people can make their own understanding from those specific dates that happen to be after the midterms in very key areas. And then, of course, after the national election.
All right, and here's another question for you, Gina. Someone in the chat wrote, or I should say, the action items that I walked through were all directed towards the Senate. But if people here in this meeting want to send a message to their House members, what should they do?
Absolutely. So after this happens on the Senate, and again, it doesn't happen. We keep saying, like, we can say no. That's why I mentioned the Bush and the Trump tax cuts, because we were able to push against all of these, right? After this happens in the Senate, it's going to go back to the House. So the House will be the last step before they send it over to the president. So right now, Republicans keep saying, or House members keep saying, oh, these are not cuts. Expanding the time limit, making sure that the parent that has a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, it's all of a sudden cut from SNAP. Those are not cuts. That's sensible fiscal responsibility, is making sure these things are an issue. It's pushing back against that narrative. Oh, it won't impact child services. It won't impact nutrition programs. That's what they're saying. And it's really important to speak about that. One of the things that we also keep hearing is, oh, it won't increase homelessness rates. So pushing against all of those narratives and say, this is how it impacts my city, my state. Please feel free to talk to us about specific technical assistance so that you can speak us to your city. But you shouldn't stop talking to your House member and say, really disappointed. You have a chance to really push back against this. And when the bill goes back to the House, is definitely the time to say no.
Great. Another question for Gina. Can you talk about the specific components of the SNAP cuts that would affect children's eligibility for SNAP? And I guess I would say, like, the umbrella for this is that any of the cuts that you walked us through that end up meaning that a household is no longer eligible for SNAP, that is the connection to children's eligibility for free school meals, because they're no longer directly certified. But are there any of the cuts that you want to particularly call out that would impact children perhaps more than others? Does that make sense?
You said it, Alexis. I mean, these tiny humans don't live on their own little house. They don't go to work and pay the rent. They're are exempted. They have these caretakers. What that looks like, whether it's grandparents, when we look at grandparents, limited income, you're 62, all of a sudden, I can't take care of my child because they just turned 8 years old. And I can't work them from the school. Now I have to look for another job. I'm getting cut off from SNAP benefits. The food benefits still keep rising. It just means less money. That's the impact, right? So less money means less resources for the child. It means grandma's now going to get sick because she's less access to food. So something happens to grandma, where does the child go if there's no other resources? So that's the way we look at it. It means it's the whole impact. You have a bucket of funds, limited funds, and that's why I spoke about homelessness. Parents, individuals, they operate on a very tight margin. One little thing happens, and that means that individuals can't pay for rent. Once you lose rent, your credit report is affected. The likelihood of you getting another apartment is incredibly difficult. Being unhoused makes it more likely for you to lose your job. So it's just a terrible cycle. And that's the way we look at it. And you are the expert on nutrition issues, but that's why I mentioned the Congressional Budget Office score that said almost 500,000 kids will be impacted. It will mean less resources for nutrition incentive programs for children. It has a long-term impact. It's what we're looking at, and that's what we can see, because you all know how everything's interrelated. It's not just one thing.
Great. There is a question. Can you comment on the proper terms that we should be using in our messages to legislators? And if I'm understanding this question correctly, I think what we are talking about here is we are opposing any cuts to SNAP. And we are explaining that cuts to SNAP that decrease benefit, that end benefits for households will have a negative effect on students and their access to free school meals. That is the lingo that I would use. Gina, to you, this is a little bit outside of our main focus for today, but there's a question: will the elderly who are already getting benefits have their benefits cut if they don't meet the new age requirement? And I think when they say age requirement here, it's also age plus work requirements.
Yeah, so SNAP has always had general work requirements that you have to do. It's these time limits, right? Like that you can only get SNAP for 3 months in a 3-year period if you can show that you have paid 20-hour work or official volunteer work. So again, that's why I use the example of the grandma taking care of the child so that mom can go to work and can do these things. That's no longer going to be done. Like grandma will have to show 20 hours of paid work, or that she's volunteering at a place that's going to sign a place that said she's volunteering for 20 hours. So it is a cut, because that means that if she can't do those 20 hours, that if she doesn't have a car, and if there is no jobs around, and I will flag that the president's budget cuts down the segment that allows for community jobs for older adults. And for the SNAP program, you would consider an older adult at 60. And so you're increasing this to 64. So people who are like, oh, I'm at 60, I'm considering an older adult, I'm exempted from a lot of these things. By increasing it to 64, people who retire at 62 with limited Social Security, what does that mean for them? And so it is a cut if now you have to do extra steps, and taking care of your child or taking care of other things no longer count for that. And one of the things when you talk about time limits is really important to note that it doesn't come with a job offer. It doesn't come with training. It doesn't come with transportation. It doesn't come with childcare. It's a requirement that is unfunded and unresourced. And in remote areas, this is even more impactful because no one's going to give you a car. And it doesn't count with the gig economy, or that there is no public transportation in majority of the US in order for people to be able to access these things.
Thank you. Tara, I'm going to ask you to take a look at the question from Leslie in the chat while I answer another question. And the question I'm addressing is, if you live in a state where all of your federal delegation is already on board, what would the action be? And I can really identify with this person because FRAC is based in DC, but I live outside of the DC area. And sometimes I say, I don't have anyone to lobby because everybody is like already on board, right? I'm lucky to have federal representatives and state representatives that are all in on these issues. So I'm with you here. But what I think we should never miss an opportunity to do is to tell them like what we hope to see their vote be, and also thank them for the work that they are doing to protect these programs that we care about, because sending them a message of thank you for votes that they've taken, or telling them how we want to vote them to vote in the future, even if we are pretty confident in what that vote will be, shows that we have their backs and that they really are representing the concerns and values of the people that they represent. So Tara, I'm going to turn it over to you and see if you have any answers about this question about the impact on a general fund for a district.
Yeah, so Leslie mentions the LCFF, which is a local control funding formula, I believe, from California specifically. And so I think that just raises a good point that every district has, or every state has their own funding formula for their own state funds. And a lot of those do take into account poverty in some way. Usually it's free and reduced price lunch rates. It could be direct certification. And so in terms of like how this will impact districts, will also vary based on states, right? And then that may also force states to kind of change their formula for funding for districts if direct certification is no longer available, or is no longer what it needs to be, because it's not counting all the kids that it should be counting.
Great. All right, well, at this point, I think I'm going to ask each panelist if there is one last closing remark that they want to make, and then we are going to wrap up. So I think we'll go in reverse order this time. Tim, let's start with you. Is there anything that from this discussion that you wanted to make sure that you were able to say?
Well, just reiterating again that school nutrition workers are literally on the front line of this issue, and they are on the serving line for kids in schools, and they're going to be the ones having to, in some cases, deal with difficult situations with hungry kids who may have parents in school lunch debt. So. Yeah, it's good for us all to stay together on this issue.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, closing remarks, it's hard to think of really one thing to focus on. I do think kind of the broader conversation around SNAP, and I know this conversation was around direct certification, but I think a really direct impact, and it's easy to draw those and connect these dots, is a cost share shift to states is going to really, really stress the state budget. And I'm really concerned that that's going to mean that education, K-12 specifically, is going to be on the chopping block.
Great, Nadia.
Yeah, I think I would say I'm just watching the chat here, and I'm seeing the challenges, not just from people who may have legislators already completely on board, what do you do, but also legislators who have made it very clear that they're not interested in hearing about these impacts. And I would say that there is a way to tailor your message based on the legislator that you're speaking to. One office may be more receptive to the idea that this is creating inefficiencies. It is creating the increased cost to states is a big one. I am not convinced that even state officials fully understand really what they would be facing should these cuts come through. So reaching out to your state officials and your governors and really tailoring your language around their priorities, there's always an inroad.
Thank you, and Gina.
Everything Nadia said, it sometimes is a lot easier for the local official, for the local mayor to be able to speak and say, this is how I can't pay for these items once they are cut, because there really is a cut. I don't have the budget. And I would strongly encourage you to look at your state budget, because across the whole, the state agencies are funded a certain way. K-12 is funded a certain way, and you don't always get 100% of the ask. So going up to say next year, it will be even less, because there will be even less federal fundings if this were to go through. So my last message is everything Nadia said, but also to say it's not a done deal. And it really takes a whole community effort to show the whole impact as a whole, and pushing back to say, you don't have to do this. Especially if it's such a bad bargain. We're not eliminating homelessness. We're not getting more housing. We're not eliminating the childcare crisis. Things are just going to get worse, and it's actually going to be more costly in the long run.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our panelists, to everyone who joined us for this webinar. We had over 1,000 people register, and I think it's because people care about what happens to individuals and families, kids, and schools. And all of these programs that we care about, be it SNAP, school meals, and other programs, they don't exist in a bubble. What happens to one program has ripple effects onto the other. And so we encourage you to take the action items that were posted in the chat and oppose these cuts to SNAP and the impacts that they would have on school meals, students, and schools. So thank you and have a good rest of the day.